First, I want to point out that this gentleman here filming is Doug Wolf from Union City, Pennsylvania. And he has volunteered to do this, and we're very appreciative that we're going to have that record of the conference. Doug is also going to start a chapter when he gets back to Union City, Pennsylvania. It's about 30 miles east of Erie. I drive through Erie 4 times a year, so this is going to work out very well. Route 90. In the area that we're educating and trying to bring new ideas into acceptance, consideration, we're often at odds with the accepted wisdom or with the accepted beliefs. And the next session is going to focus on how to teach when you have to teach against the grain, against the already accepted ideologies. And we have 3 people who are going to do this, all experienced educators. We have Professor Param Srikantia of Baldwin Wallace College, which is in Cleveland, and he's going to do this via a type of demonstration which is entirely in his hands as soon as we start. And we have Professor Kuksma did not get here, so she's not going to be on that program. Professor Lucille Eckrich of ISU College of Education from Southern Illinois is going to explore how to interest pre-service teachers, by which I'm thinking you mean before they're actually in the profession, but they're about to become teachers, how to interest them in monetary reform. And Mr. Steven Walsh, who is a member of our Chicago chapter and a lifelong educator, is going to discuss his experience in this area. And I know he's very interested in reaching younger and younger people to start them very early on monetary reform. So at this point, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Professor Srikantia.
Good afternoon, my name is Param, and I'm profoundly grateful to the American Monetary Institute and to Mr. Steven Zarlenga for inviting me to share my own experiments and experiences in the educational domain. My name is Param. I teach at a liberal arts college that has several graduate programs in business, and I teach 7 classes every semester, so I come in contact with around 300 students. In my previous life, I have worked with corporations, and also, and I'm most embarrassed to make this confession to you, I have even done a short stint at the World Bank as a consultant. And I would be less embarrassed if I had worked for the mafia than for the World Bank in all earnest. But that aside, throughout, in the way in which I run my MBA classes, as Steven so eloquently articulated, I run into a situation where you have people who seem to be significantly invested in the status quo. You know, these are graduate students, some of them are executive MBA students who have been promoted up the ranks in their organization and who have a level of investment and a level of faith in the ability of the quote-unquote system to deliver, favorably in the context of their aspirations. And I try to do a variety of things in the classroom to try to raise doubt and critical inquiry in terms of the dominant models and paradigms in which they are being socialized. And I'm going to take the next 15 minutes just giving you a slice of what I do, like a sampler plate, in terms of teaching methods. Firstly, one of the things that I begin with in my classes is to talk about and I want to make it clear that my comments will neither be erudite nor technically sound. My approach to MBA education has been, you have business students who have a very short attention span, and to capture their interest and to start engaging with the process of questioning, the status quo. Okay, so one of the things that I begin with is to start off with a very simple formulation that I saw at a workshop, which contrasted the way in which some of the Western cultures have given us a framework or mental model inside of which we live our lives, compared to how some of the rest of the world lives. And here, I'm going to draw it on the board, and I'm going to be using the board quite a bit here. We have it set up. Are you able to hear me at the back when I move to the board? Thank you. We have it set up in our minds that when we live our life, we need to have, let's say, money in order to do the things which we want to do, which may be vacation in Paris, so that we can be happy. And I find a number of my MBA students socialized into this model of thinking, and in fact, their very purpose in earning an MBA is to be able to have more money in order to do the things that they can do in order to be happy. And I begin to ask them, have you ever considered that there are times when you have been miserable in a hotel room in Paris and joyous and happy vacuuming your basement? Bring in an ability to start questioning the dominance of having, of materialism as the basis for one's existence. And to point out how, if you really look at, you travel around the world, you sometimes see children playing on dirt heaps around the world, and they look happy. Because in terms of their being, who they are being, they're generating that from within. And I begin to have them question how most of us grow up within a mainstream paradigm which seems to suggest that having is a precondition. Once you have, then you can do, and then you can be, and to reverse the order in which that goes. The other way in which I try to bring this up is to take examples of a concept or a construct that they have believed in and they have taken for granted, and to systematically deconstruct that both at a logical level, a theoretical level, as well as at the level of drama and pantomimes and so on. So I'm just going to give you a sample of that. Usually one of the ones that goes down very well in thawing out their cognitive structures, which have become kind of reified and frozen. I ask them, how many of you have been through courses where you know that there is a developed world and a developing world? And obviously everybody has been indoctrinated into that mode of thinking. Then I start a theoretical deconstruction of the notion of development and underdevelopment that the economists have given us. But I will not entertain you with that, bore you with that rather, but instead I sometimes take it down to a level where they can easily see how the dominant mental models that we are trained to think in terms of have come into existence through very basic perceptual and interpretational processes. For example, I pose it to them, and I learned this from another educational workshop called the Landmark Forum that I went to, and I adapted their material to my teaching, that have you ever considered that you are simultaneously born into two worlds? And of course, people look quizzically at me like, what's he talking about? Like, is he giving us some Hindu shit here? Have you ever considered that? And then I kind of try to explain how one of the ways in which a very well-established mental model like development and underdevelopment, which guides so much policy, and on which the entire World Bank and IMF are predicated on these constructs, how would they have come into existence? And I just say, try this parable, try this, and see if this fits. I say that one of the words in which we all live, is called the word of what happens. So things are constantly happening, like I'm talking. I just plan. So there's a word of what happens, but human beings don't live in that world for too long. We quickly escape into another word called interpretation or story. So I say, consider the possibility that there was a Western observer who took a boat ride to Samoa, got off the boat, and encountered the Samoan population, and for this example, you are the Samoan people. What does he see? The first thing that he sees in the world of what happens is that they are dressed in leaves. Clearly, they are dressed in leaves resides in the world of what happens. But they don't live in that world. The Western observer immediately takes that qualitative fact and ascribes a judgment to it. Oh, they're dressed in leaves, these people look primitive. So notice that dressed in leaves is in the word of what happens, and primitive is an interpretation that arises from it. When the person re-engages with the Samoans, he might see that they do not have the sophisticated plumbing facilities that both of us are used to. And they just go when they have to. What happens? As the proverb goes, shit happens. And the interpretation is how barbaric. Notice how seemingly innocuous facts are transformed almost unconsciously and very quickly into an evaluation of it. The third thing, you might notice that when they're thirsty, they drink water. Right? And the interpretation is, oh my goodness, they're poor, they have no choices. And I kind of show how this comes into existence. All of a sudden, an entire population, and the World Bank will send its mission, to go and study Samoa, and they'll come back with a diagnosis that these people are horribly underdeveloped, and a prescription that they need to be, adopting some of the myths of Western economic, revival. A whole culture has been transformed into primitive, barbaric, and poor. The way this happens is in an instant. For example, and I'm going to demonstrate this as I do in the classroom with lenses. The first lens is a layer of interpretation, let's say, where I see people dressed in leaves, and I put on my first lens and all of a sudden, everybody here occurs through this lens as primitive. The next time I encounter you, and I find the inexorable march of human, of nature calling, I put on a second lens, and we already passed for a moment. And all of a sudden, the people of Samoa occur as primitive and barbaric, and have an interpretational frame through which I'm looking at them. And the third time, they seem to be drinking water as opposed to the multitude of colored carbonated drinks. I put on a third frame, whereby I complete the constellation, the interpretation. I look, the entire civilization, the culture, occurs to me as being primitive, barbaric, and poor. The true civilized culture of Samoa has disappeared from me. Okay? And I don't even know that I don't know that this is what I have done. It lives in what the epistemologists call as I don't know that I don't know. And an entire paradigm has been created, and I come back to my endowed chair, in economics, and write a textbook on developmental economics. So beginning with examples like this and pantomimes and dramatizations, I try to invite them to question the very basis of the dominant models that they're being socialized into in the course of their education. I often use, part of my effort is to try to unglamorize material success, and one of the ways in which I try to do it is through stories, stories of different kinds. Books, I give them copies of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And for those of you who are familiar with Howard Zinn, the way I relate it to my curriculum is, well, if I wanted to learn the history of the United States, what would you tell me to do? Take a course in history. But have you considered that when if you were to, what Howard Zinn does is to interview African Americans and interview Native Americans and ask these people, what do you perceive as the history of the United States? What is the history of the United States? And each of these populations has a very different experience and story of what the history of the United States is compared to the white settlers. So I kind of start talking to them about how, most of our business education socializes you into accepting a hard reality out there, much like physicists or chemists' beliefs. And we tend to forget that the realities in which we are operating are socially constructed realities that come into existence through a process of consensual validation, through a process of interpretation. And entire people can be thought of as being primitive, barbaric, and poor through layers of interpretation that we develop. Where else in our inquiry have we uncritically accepted this state of affairs? And then often I use that as a segue to talk about our concepts of money and what are the stories that we have made up that places a ceiling on what could truly be possible. I have a handout which I'd like to pass out, and I'm going to read just by the time it gets to you. This is an example of the kind of stories that I use to unglamorize the quest, the material quest. It's called The Irony of the Rat Race, and several of you might have read it on the internet. Follow with me even if you don't have it. A boat docked in a tiny Mexican village. An American tourist complimented the Mexican fisherman on the quality of his fish and asked how long it took him to catch them. "Not very long," answered the Mexican. "But then, why didn't you stay out longer and catch more?" asked the American. The Mexican explained that his small catch was sufficient to meet his needs and those of his family. The American asked, "But what do you do with the rest of your time?" "I sleep late, fish a little, play with my children, and take a siesta with my wife. In the evenings, I go into the village to see my friends, have a few drinks, play the guitar, and sing a few songs. I have a full life," replied the Mexican. The American interrupted. "I have an MBA from Harvard, and I can help you. You should start by fishing longer every day. You can then sell the extra fish you catch. With the extra revenue, you can buy a bigger boat. With the extra money the larger boat will bring, you can buy a second one and a third one and so on until you have an entire fleet of trawlers. Instead of selling your fish to a middleman, you can negotiate directly with the processing plants and maybe even open your own plant. You can then leave this little village and move to Mexico City, Los Angeles, or even New York City. From there, you can direct your huge enterprise." "How long would that take?" asked the Mexican. 20, perhaps 25 years, replied the American. "And after that?" "Afterwards, that's when it gets really interesting," answered the American, laughing. "When your business gets really big, you can start selling stocks and make millions." "Millions, really? And after that?" "After that, you'll be able to retire, live in a tiny village near the coast, sleep late, play with your children, catch a few fish, take a siesta, and spend your evenings drinking and enjoying your friends." You know? My approach has been to read the biographies of famous people and accumulate stories like this, which I generously use. So every one of my classes is sprinkled with a handful of these stories, which makes people kind of question what they're being socialized into. Part of my trying to unglamorize the dominant material world is also through pantomimes. For example, I ask the MBA class, what's the dream job that you would like to occupy if all the constraints of reality were removed? You know, that you could aspire to, and you know, I have them give a speech on a dream job, and it's amazing how homogeneous MBA students are in their career aspirations. It's usually a CEO of a company, you know, and I then say, okay, let's assume that you become one of the highly developed inhabitants of this planet. You know, you occupy a position at a prestigious firm in New York City as CEO. You remember the story of the Samoan fisherman? Right? How you might have seen the Samoan fisherman through the three lenses. Let's assume that the tables have been turned and the Samoan fisherman is brought to the New York City and he's told to become a fly on the wall and watch your life as CEO. You know, what does your life look like to this Samoan fisherman? And here's what he sees. And I say, this is the life that you're craving for, planning for. You know, have you considered that within this robotic machine of industrialized culture, you're going to be a cog in the wheel of a highly bureaucratized function, you know, that operates as a subdivision of some major monolithic organization. And that is drift, right? And is this the life of freedom that you're craving for? And then I begin to bring it all back to questioning the concepts of abundance and scarcity, that Western culture has its head up its ass. Pardon the language. I say this because I often say very provocative things in the classroom and get people riled up and mad at me because otherwise they're going to be sleeping. Okay? Because I say that this is the sleight of hand that happened. Abundance and scarcity were meant to be pluralistic concepts. There are many ways in which our lives are blessed with abundance. There are many ways in which our lives are bedeviled with scarcity. What happened somewhere along the line was the economists took these experiences of abundance and scarcity and fit it into their narrow Procrustean bed, translating it to wealth and poverty. And what happened as a result of that was the very richness and the multidimensionality of life was lost. And I asked them, share a story about a time when you felt in the presence of a great deal of abundance. And I point out how none of those stories had anything to do with money. So it is enlarging the conception of abundance as a broader construct. Thank you very much.
We're going to do it at the end. Good afternoon. It's a privilege it's an honor to be with you and spend a few moments talking with you. My name is Lucille Eckrich, and I'm in my 6th year as an assistant professor at Illinois State University, where I teach in a field called Foundations of Education, and it focuses on the philosophical, social, and historical foundations of education. Most of my students are undergraduates who are preparing to become K-12 teachers. The rest are graduate students who are already teachers and are working to become educational leaders, either as teachers or as school or district administrators. And I just want to talk with you, I hope in 15 minutes, about why and how I'm trying to include monetary critique and reform in my teaching, my service, and my scholarship at ISU. And I just want to start with a historical anecdote that I think helps to explain the state of economic illiteracy among Americans today. Although the public school system, as we know it today, kind of has its roots in the common school movement in the 1830s, it wasn't until really the 1890s that public schooling as a mass movement kind of began to take off, and more schools grew up from the local level and were organized into districts, and these started to include secondary schools. And as that happened, there were really debates among the schoolmen of the time about what the purpose of and the curriculum of these schools ought to be. The schoolmen were mostly college professors, many of them actually college presidents of the leading colleges, and some school administrators who had graduated from those colleges. And in 1892, a group was formed called the Committee of 10 that was really to deliberate in 9 subcommittees on what the secondary school committee should be. Each subcommittee had a different focus of the curriculum. You might not look familiar, but those foci were Latin, Greek, separate foci, English, other modern languages, math and physical sciences, the natural sciences, geography, and the last group was the history, civil government, and political economy subcommittee. That committee actually debated whether history should be taught at the secondary school level at all, saying that only college students needed to study history. But in the end, they did decide that there should be 8 years of history curriculum, including 4 years in high school, which would cover French history, English history, American history, and the last year in civil government. What's of particular significance, I think, for the question of Americans' economic literacy is this subcommittee's decision, which was unanimously approved, to exclude formal instruction in political economy from school programs. It's also noteworthy to note that this resolution was introduced by Woodrow Wilson, who was then a young professor, and later, as you know, became a U.S. president. And according to the minutes of the subcommittee's work, he actually argued that scientific history, which would involve criticism and examination of evidence, had no place in schools because it tended to confuse young people. The rest of the committee didn't quite agree with that and did agree that at the later levels, the higher levels of secondary school, there should be some looking at secondary and primary sources and distinguishing among authorities. But they did all agree that political economy should be omitted from the school topic. And as you know of the times, at that time in the early 1900s, political economy was very much a serious topic of everyday conversation and everyday people's lives. But the historical record shows that this Committee of 10's work on the secondary school curriculum did prove to be very influential in what curriculum became standardized state by state thereafter over the 1900s. And to borrow a term from sort of the third world development studies, we might actually say that it's not that far ago, our grandparents, our parents, and even ourselves were intentionally underdeveloped in this regard. I could take a moment to poll the audience and say, to what extent is this true of your own K through 12 schooling experience, but I'll leave that for now. And it would be interesting to see how many hands would remain up when we eliminate those who studied outside of the United States and those who studied outside of the public school system. And so the question to think for yourselves, to what extent did your K through 12 public schooling have any kind of focus on political economy or critical economic literacy? If my students of today are any indication, they do have very little understanding of kind of the economic life and exchange relations that they live amidst. Somehow we have come to some kind of critique, and I know we all have stories to tell about how we've gotten there. But my students, if I poll them, usually at most a quarter or a half of them have taken any kind of economics class during high school. And most of those report, if they have taken one, it's focused on consumer economics. And 1 or 2 out of 4 or 5 maybe have studied the stock market a little bit. But there's been nothing about a critical perspective. Even in college or university, many never take an economics course, and if they did take an economics course, they get largely conventional economics in those courses, I know, because that was part of my own undergraduate degree. They do get some kind of critical perspective in a sociology or philosophy or history or political science class, but those professors are actually seldom informed about sort of a critical analysis of money. I think it's actually too late to wait to the college level, and this Steven is going to address a little bit K through 12, because college students today are either working full-time and going to school full-time at the same point, and they have no time to think, to actually do really thinking work, or they're going into serious debt through their college education, even if they're just at a public school. And so they're being drawn into the rat race right from the get-go, and they have to get out of school and try and make the most money they can to start paying off their interest-bearing school loans and the mortgage loan that they're hopefully going to get. And so the question is, some of this work really has to start at the K through 12, or at least the high school level. And so one group of people to work with for AIM members are teacher professional associations, and to work with the economic understanding and literacy among those people. Another group that I think is important are college and university professors in a field like mine, which is devoted to trying to have students understand the relationship between school and society, to understand the difference between education, socialization, and indoctrination, to understand the issues of identity formation and power relations in relation to race, class, identity, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, disability, all those different examples. It's a huge field, and it becomes a question of what you include in the one shot we get with these students who are becoming teachers. They take one foundations course. In the remaining few minutes I have, I want to talk about 3 ways that I've started to work on integrating critical economic literacy and monetary critique into my courses. I have yet to really make it the overarching frame of a course, and if I get tenure this year, hopefully that will come to be. And I will make it an overarching frame. But the first way is that, I don't know if any of you are familiar, or many of you familiar with Paulo Freire's work. He was a Brazilian, a middle-class Brazilian person whose bottom fell out of his family's experience during the Depression. He was about 10 years old at that time. And so he experienced poverty, hunger, and really devoted his life after that to trying to relieve the systemic as well as the ideational conditions that reproduce poverty. And he advocated a dialogical approach to teaching, which he called problem-posing education, as opposed to what is a more conventional approach of where the teacher sort of deposits the knowledge into the students, and the students give that knowledge back pretty much unreflected and unchanged, and he called that system, somewhat ironically for this group perhaps, the banking form of education. And this text, it challenges students to grapple with questions of who are oppressed and who are oppressors and why. Despite the fact that many of my students are at a public university, they're borrowing a significant amount of money to go to school. Most of them are first generation students in university. They don't consider themselves oppressed. Neither do they consider themselves oppressors. And in Freire's philosophy, those are pretty much the two choices. If you're not one, you're the other, and he forces to grapple in sort of dualities. It helps students to question issues of whose knowledge is taught and whose voices are left out. My one problem with the text, and yet the opportunity that it presents for me, is that Freire is intensely concerned about systemic oppression at the political economic level, and yet he never names it for what it is. It's kind of a black box in the middle of his philosophy. It's central, it's key, it's systemic, and yet it's never really unpacked or analyzed. And so I started to see that as my task in the class, and this has become a second way that I try to develop my students' economic literacy. I've actually tried, very different from the presentations we're having here and the wealth of knowledge and experience and just giving that to students. Partly I don't have all that wealth of knowledge, I'm learning it, but also I think in Freire's problem-posing mode, it's a method of having students learn from their own experience and look at the contradictions and problematize their own experiences. And so to kind of help them interrogate, this role that money that is, the lifeblood of, our society, it seems, the role it plays, I asked them two pretty straightforward questions. First, what do you do? And what in your lifetime, what do you and what in your lifetime are you likely to buy, sell, borrow, loan, give, take, receive? They kind of brainstorm a while on that question, and then I ask, what is it that you're doing? Or what will you be doing when you buy, sell, borrow, loan, give, take, and or receive these things? Kind of in more simple terms, maybe, what are we doing in our economic exchange relations? And they're not having any text, they're trying to make sense of their lived experience. And the discussions that ensue are quite interesting, sometimes predictable, sometimes very unpredictable and revealing. It's led them to realize and think more deeply about how they do survive and whether that's flourishing at all, and the role that borrowing and debt are playing already in their lives, not to mention their parents' lives. It's led them to debate the nature of taxes as being taken or freely given, and for what, and how taxes differ from other kinds of exchanges. It helps them to kind of problematize the taken for granted and unexamined role of money in their lives, and then can lead to more serious exploration to the extent that we give time in the course for this in working with literature that is the base that many of you at this conference are already working with. The last way that I pursue monetary critique with my students is through the issue of school funding, and Steven is also going to shed some more light on this. As you probably know, public schooling in the US is largely funded at the local level through property taxes, what in UK they call rates, I understand. This might not be such a problem if we had an economy in which wealth were distributed to reflect its creation, but because of our interest-fueled, debt-based monetary system, we don't have that kind of economy. And so locally funded schools mirror this inequity in our economy. It becomes clear as we work with the history and the actual mechanisms in the state of Illinois of how schools are funded that there aren't easy answers for how to overcome the inadequacy and inequity in school funding. We look at how it's changed piecemeal over the last 30 years, become a little bit better, and yet not really addressing the issues. And even recent legislation that's so far unsuccessful that would address sort of the structural deficit in Illinois and the regressive nature of the taxation system here. And we look at, the current governor, like some previous governors who are stealing pension fund money away from the worst underfunded pension fund system in the country is in Illinois. And instead of, that's where he's getting the money, not to improve schooling, but basically to keep up with inflation and maintain services as they are. And this is where I actually see some concrete hope. And I've talked with a few of this about this idea, but my work in monetary critique and reform has led me to conceptualize what may be a silver lining in the local school funding issue. And I just want to explain that idea. It's to establish a complementary currency at the county or multi-county level that would be issued by the public, probably from a multi-sector, not-for-profit organization, but issued by the public to the school districts in partial exchange for public education. So in that sense, it's an education-backed currency, in part. The school officials and the employees would use that currency along with US dollars. It would only be like 2 to 5% of their salary and payment for supplies probably. They would use it to buy goods and services produced locally by businesses that agree to accept it. Those businesses could in turn use and trade with other traders in the local community that also agreed to accept it. In the long run, which is only the year's end, the currency would be receivable back by the public as partial payment for their property taxes of any local taxpayer who had some of the currency to pay with. And so it's a tax foundation local currency, and that makes it have a little bit more confidence and makes it a much more systemic form of a local currency, which, as Steve has said, have often been pretty marginalized and insignificant forms of currency. The public then could reissue that currency in the next and subsequent years in equal, greater, or lesser amounts depending on how much the local economy could bear. And such a county currency could achieve, I think, the following three goals. First, it would supplement and eventually partially supplant property tax dollars for funding schools, freeing up dollars for other county needs. Second, it would stimulate the local economy that it serves as an interest-free medium of exchange. And third, it would enable community members to learn about interest and inflation-free money through their own transactions. I've been thinking about this idea for a couple of years now, and I'm relatively certain from reading that it's legal, it's doable, and it's not only compatible with what AMI is advocating, but it would help to pave the way for that kind of monetary reform at the national level. I'm decently positioned in central Illinois to identify and work with a rural community that's really depressed and where this could be piloted. And being in an educational administration department, there are superintendents, there are principals both in the department as well as in the region the university is connected with that I think could be interested in working with me on it. I would welcome any collaboration from any of you if this idea is of interest, and I would hope that at next year's AMI conference that we could report some progress being made on it. Thank you.
I have a handout. It's a double-sided two-page handout. So if you could raise your hand, and Steve and I have a friend in the back who will pass. So if you don't have a two-page handout, please raise your hand, and then at times when you're more visual, you can look at that. I'm just going to add on a few comments to what was given to begin with. Can you hear me okay? Do I need?
Yeah.
Just to add on the Gutwell. There's experiments in local education going on, and we'll bring those up. I'm going to actually stick to the sheet. Yeah. discuss is there's an infrastructure problem, a serious infrastructure problem. Lucille and Param have both alluded to it. What do we need to do right in the K-12 situation to make things better? And I'm going to tell you the best ideas and what is happening, and some interesting things even happened this summer, and I'll report them. What I feel necessary to do is to report the as-is situation, what's going on and what resources we need in public education to make things work out. And my own background is I visited a lot of schools. I'm a math and science specialist. I was at the Teachers Academy for Math and Science. I've probably worked in 100 Chicago schools. I've taught on St. Lawrence Island, an Eskimo community speaking Siberian Yupik. I taught in Fairbanks. And I videotaped schools in France, public and private. And I've, 3 years ago, 2 years after an earthquake, I was in El Salvador visiting schools there too. And both my parents were teachers, so I come with a very strong interest in K-12 education. When I go around to schools, I put them in 3 categories: good, so-so, and scary. A good school, you can imagine that as your suburban school, a little higher socioeconomics, and the kids go to that school, and because of the culture and the socioeconomics, they're able to do well academically, and they get some break in the sense that they're working on their multiple intelligences. No longer in schools, and it's true, we don't think about IQ anymore, we think about multiple intelligences. So in those schools, the kid has some music background, may have some art, but they're finding a way to express themselves that's individual to them. They're growing up fairly healthy. And things are going well there. On international scores, and when we compare scores, these kids are part to doing fairly good with their scores on an international basis. They're average. And that's a small group of schools. You can, and it's based mostly on the socioeconomics. We can guess the 10% at the top 20%. We then have a very large number of so-so schools. I'm presently at a so-so school, and what's going on in those schools is that there's dissonance of some type going on. Usually there's gangs or drugs, and it's not in the school, it's in the neighborhoods. There's negative influences. Parents feel they have to be vigilant. There's something going on. Often it may mean they keep their kids home after school, and those kids get a lack of exercise. And in Chicago, by the way, has the greatest obesity rate in the country for children in schools. We got out of 80% of our requirement at the state level for physical education, and a few years later it's paying off. Our kids are getting bigger. The question is then, what are we going to start doing about this? And the other thing is to balance those budgets in the so-so school. They've taken out music, they've taken out a lot of physical education, they've taken out music or art or both. I happen to be in a school where you may get a little bit of art, you may get a little bit of music. Probably no music, but you might get some art. And the things that bring out multiple intelligences, those things to reach our children to the fullest potential. And by the way, it's in their mission statement that we want our children to be well-rounded for the 21st century. But that's not what they're working on. They're working on, and teachers are great, they're working darn hard. They're trying to give the kids a boost so they can make it in high school. And at the so-so schools, maybe they can get beyond that. But those children are not really reaching their fullest potential. We'll come back to them. I want to spend a moment with the scary schools. Our mission at the Teachers Academy was to work with the lower end schools. And in those schools, and we found out it was really hard. If a school's that broken, they're not ready for professional development. You're using your multiple intelligences in that school to get through the day. The children want to be able to get home safe.
In a scary school, there could be a fight breaking out during the school. Instead of finding your fullest potential, you're using your multiple intelligences to be safe. It's not a good situation. What are we going to do? Okay. I find I've got now, that's the as-is situation. Now, how do we go from those situations to finding great schools? Well, we can do that. I've worked very hard to reach a lot of people, a lot of education reform people, and there is a solution, and it's going to be a hefty price tag, but it's going to pay off. The biggest solution is that we need 2 teachers in every classroom, and this is why. Children grow up. When a child is an infant, it's a primate infant. It has to bond. It's not a matter if it will bond. It's just a matter of how that infant is going to bond. Later on, what's going on there is the child's growing up, and this is the organizing questions that licensed clinical social workers use in their longitudinal studies in Minnesota. Alan Sharofe, a head researcher, shared this with me. And the infant's asking this as earliest on. Mom comes into the room, the infant's there. If I have a need and I turn to you, how do you respond? The infant has the need. It sees mom, it sees dad, it sees the caregiver coming into the room. How do you respond? Is there cuddling? Is there kindness? Is there ignoring, censoring out the child's there? Is there abuse? Everything that's going on is impacting that child. And later on, as this child gets into pre-K, kindergarten, school situations, you can start observing it and looking at it, and you can see patterns. And wherever a child is at, no matter what their background and what they've experienced, the clinical social workers have found that relationship is the thing that can help. And it can be a friend. I've seen special ed children help each other out in dynamic ways. It can be the teacher, it's the parent, it's everybody. And what happens in the classroom is we put the teacher in charge. At my school's Tonti Elementary School. On average, we have 30 kids in a classroom with 1 teacher, and it's a so-so school. In that school, that teacher's got to bring up all of the children pedagogically in all the disciplines 1 year. Second, then as the behavior issues come up, Johnny needs attention, and our kids are starving for attention. They're starving for attention, discipline, and activities. And what's happening? Well, the teacher can't do it. The teacher just can't do it. It's not even humanly, it's mathematically like the interest rate. Nature doesn't work that way. Matter of fact, in terms of, we're not raising widgets, we're wasting people who need to work in the opposite direction. We need more care at that younger age especially. So what the clinical social workers are suggesting, and other people's, myself and other educators are suggesting, we need at least 2 educators, the pedagogical specialist and the child development specialist. So that brings up a big cost issue, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But then you have somebody meeting the children's needs. Now, I've taken lots of principals and teachers on retreats. In one of the worst scary schools in Chicago, an abuse center across the street, kids are in there at 60% turnover rate officially. It's actually much higher than that because it doesn't show the kids coming in for 3 days, leaving because they just came out of an abuse center across the street. In that school, I worked with the counselor and the teachers, and in those classrooms, and it took them a while to get this because they couldn't even get away from their paradigm to idealize this, is you needed a pedagogical teacher and 3 highly trained professionals like licensed clinical social workers in every classroom in the worst case scenarios. So that's what we're facing to trying to create a healthy learning environment. So, so 2 teachers in every classroom. And on the other end, I found some teachers, because of often their ethnic background, their ties to the community, they can do it all just about. There's other reasons. If you look in do a research, when you integrate curriculum, if economics is going to get in there, it's integrated curriculum. You may want 2 teachers in the classroom for that. There's 3 peace schools in Israel where they have Arab and Jewish children, or Muslim and Jewish children together in the classroom, and there they have an Arab and a Jew in every classroom. Sometimes in our neighborhoods, you need that type of help too. And so those are reasons for 2 teachers in the classroom. So that's a bit on step 1. The other thing is to reach to that fullest potential. You haven't done that in 6 hours. You've done reading, writing, and some basic areas. So the second thing, part of the solution is we got to increase the day longer, not to do more of the same old, but we got to reach that multiple intelligences. We have to have kids trying out musical instruments, having kids try out, maybe for some kids it's chess. If you see the Mad Hot Ballroom, it's a documentary in New York where your children are learning to dance. It could be anything after school, but they need to explore their multiple intelligences, or we're going to make them rich, to make society rich, to keep their cultures and keep us alive culturally speaking. Third is, if we keep up the present system and we have 2-parent households working, and we also need the young children socialized, we need 2 years of pre-K before kindergarten. Step 4, we also need children learning about nature programs, and I'm suggesting that we have a 1 week in the summer where kids are involved in their natural intelligences, getting outdoors, and we get them outdoors. Some kids in the city don't even know that's Lake Michigan. They know it's a lake, but they don't know it's Lake Michigan. They've never gone camping, caving, etc. The other thing during the summer too, you could have extended programs. Our children in the city would love to be helping farmers bale hay, helping bring the cows in, and doing that type of work. It would be a tremendous thing. So how can we cooperate between educator and the larger communities? How can we get that experiential education going? And we really, really need that piece to be strong. We need a commitment in there. So, in summary of that, I'm saying I do not know of what higher goal we can have than to raise healthy children to their fullest potential in a healthy and safe society and world. Now, costs. I'm using the American Advancement for Science. I was in science, but they did a 1993-94 study, and what would it take to improve education? It was Project 2061, and you may have heard of some of that. And chapter 3 was finances. And I said, oh good, I'm going to find out the cost. And they couldn't. They put in so many variables, and they had the math and science right there, and they couldn't come up with it. Well, I'm going to give you some of the cost. Basically, if you double the teacher population, and this is $94, the total bill was $260 billion we spent in education, K-12, in 93-94, of which, too, I know Steve would want me to point out, for the last 30 years, 7 to 10% between there, that's what the federal government's contribution is to local education, K-12, 7 to 10% per year. 60% of the $260 billion was for instruction in that year. That would be $156 billion. So you got to add that to the total because you've just doubled the teachers, and you're at $416 billion. And you can see it, it's in my paper in front of you there. If you lengthen if you put in 2 years, half day for pre-K, you've lengthened the educational time by 1/13. K-12, you're adding on the essence of another year. And when you do that figure, that's 104 billion. No, that's extending the school day, I'm sorry, by 2 hours. You have basically a 6-hour day now, you want to extend it by 2 hours, that's a third of 6, it's 33%, and so you can add that onto the bill. You can see step 2 costs, sorry. Cost for step 3 is that pre-K and adding on 1/13 of the cost to extend things to the pre-K, that was 24.3 billion. I had step 4 at summer camps. I've run summer camp programs from children, getting them out of the city. And it's about $500 per child. And now with recent costs, it's been up towards $600 per person. And I've been taking out the child, their parent, and their teacher. Imagine going to science camp, learning about freshwater biology and terrestrial ecology with your parent and your teacher. And we work on ideas for renewing education under those experiences. We've had some great experiences, but I'm going to get to the economic education for a second here. In 93, 94 dollars, the inflation rate is 22.1%. And 1 minute, okay. The increase would be $347 billion. So it's over double the cost. So that's the calculation. One little point is, please don't get in the habit of blaming. Teachers will blame parents, the administrator, everyone can get blamed. Everyone has a role to play in this to make it better. Thank you.
Let's have a question period.
Might go more to Steven than anybody else, but as someone who hired the product of the public school system, I found it to be unsatisfactory. And once I got into the study of money and the economic paradigm, I realized that it's a factor in the destruction of the family. And I am quite skeptical that the public school system can compensate for that. Can you address that and give me a little hope?
But I work in a sub-school, I work in a neighborhood that
this school this year was 99% Mexican American, mostly immigrants. And you got to work to create community. South of our school, you have gangs coming in from that direction, and from the east, you have Gata gangs. What I'm working on is to build that community, to make education so valuable in that community, they're not going to let the gangs come in. And when the children go home, in there I put in the health part. The kids got to be able to go home. There's got to be enough money, decently, or providingly enough money in the family. And then if there's gangs. It's not if you're going to be a gang, it's whose side you're going to be on to be safe. You got to break that, and you break it by working with the parents. I could go into a lot more detail on that, but what I'm working on is very strongly connecting with those parents and saying, we're drawing the line, and education is going to be important, and no one's going to stop it in our community.
Regarding what Lucille and the rest said, if you think the grade school and high school kids are narrow-minded about economics, wait till you meet the economics professors in college. When I began to teach at the new school, I had let me known that Bob Halbrunner, who was head of the department, hired me because he thought I was a Wall Street thug, in his words, because I run the business students. He then came to me, I began teaching money and banking and general economic thought. He said that I was confusing the students. He said that I was making the students think there was more than one way of exploiting them. because I was talking about interest and rent. He said, there's only one way of exploiting people, and that's by hiring them and extracting surplus value. So I went to the whole board and I said, you know, this Stalinist twit is trying to disagree with what I'm saying. I want the students to have an election. 74% of the students suggested I become head of the department. Howard Runner tore up the petition, stamped with both feet on him, and said he was going to contribute his entire salary to the new school and $1 million if they would let him become head of the department. Needless to say, the usual votes won, and I found that there was no way of introducing reality into the curriculum, especially the kind of financial reality that we've all been talking about here. There is no way, if you look at the course curriculum in the graduate studies, there's no way to get it in. So I left, my most imaginative students all found that out. They said, we wanted to come here and study graduate economics to change how society is. We had a sense of injustice. We didn't come here to learn stupid mathematics about statistics that you could never apply them to. What the hell, we're going to do something honest for a living and go make money, but get out of academia. I left academia, and I wouldn't have got in were it not for the University of Missouri trying to change this, but we're the only school in the country that's trying to talk about these kinds of financial issues.
Just one note. Ecology and the global warming, and there's a very strong awareness among a lot of educators for that. And this summer there was 2 retreats for teachers to go to where they brought economics, geography,